Hey everybody, it's Bill Houston with the Bill Houston Podcast. This is the Merrimack Valley tube trailer theory video. I'm going to be reading from a report which you can get online, and it's called The Black Swan at Merrimack Valley, and you can get a copy by going to tinyurl.com/Black Swan Merrimack Valley intro. That's tinyurl.com/Black Swan Merrimack Valley intro.
They do seem overwhelmed. Is this an event that a gas company can be prepared for?
I don't know if anybody can prepare for something of this magnitude. I use the term a black swan event, where it's low probability and high consequence, and that's what we have here. A very low probability that this would happen twice in my years in the gas industry that I know of, the one in Lexington and this one here. And this one was much more dramatic with over 70 fires or explosions. We don't know yet how many houses exploded and how many just burned. I haven't seen any of that data, but just the magnitude of this is really, really very
remarkable.
It's remarkable.
Now, this term black swan, as it applies to high consequence events, was coined by an author, former Wall Street trader, and now academic, Nassim Nicholas Taleb. He thinks a lot about not only risk, but also complexity and disorder, fragility and robustness.
Nassim Taleb is here. He is a professor, philosopher, and author. His 2007 book, The Black Swan, predicted that fragility in financial markets could spark a global economic crisis. It has sold nearly 3 million copies worldwide. It was described by the Times of London as one of the 12 most influential books since World War II. His latest is called The Bed of Procrustes, Philosophical and Practical Aphorisms. I am pleased to have Nassim Taleb back at this table. Welcome. Black Swan was a huge success, lots of accolades.
Because people didn't understand the Black Swan.
Right.
They thought that I was inviting them to predict these rare events, when in fact I was proposing something drastically different, try to be robust to them, identify fragility, and try to be robust to them. So I wrote that postscript, which is exactly the opposite of what people were thinking at the time as a solution to the Black Swan.
So at this point, it's going to be somewhat beneficial to have a brief discussion of the basics of risk. There's just a few basic concepts that are very useful to discuss at this time. So the first is going to be this thing called an environmental impact statement, an EIS. And this is an attempt to quantify risk of a proposed project, like building a power plant, for example, or building a pipeline or a compressor station, and to actually try to propose mitigations for some of these risks or even prohibitions. Dr. Tony Ingraffia here is going to go into a little bit more about what is an EIS.
So first, just briefly, what is an environmental impact statement? What's it supposed to do? Well, it's supposed to identify potential impacts to the environment, and then it's supposed to assess those for their potential severity, and then it's supposed to propose either mitigation to reduce that severity, or if the severity is judged in the impact statement to be too severe a severity, it's supposed to propose a prohibition.
You know, in a 5-minute presentation, you can't say everything, so you have to simplify to some degree. So Dr. Ingraffia, for this particular presentation, probably in the interest of clarity, he omitted one important point. Part of the purpose of an environmental impact statement is to propose project alternatives, including the no action alternative. So you heard Dr. Ingraffia mention some words here like severity. So this is getting back to the basics of risk. So when scientists are talking about risk, they're talking about two different axes. They're talking about a two-dimensional matrix. And on one axis we have consequence or severity. In this chart, I have that on the x-axis, going left and right. So we have less severe to the left and more severe to the right. And then we have one more axis, and that's called likelihood. Now this is where there's basically guesswork involved. This is why Nassim Nicholas Taleb is averse to using risk assessments in a predictive way. He thinks that's a bad idea. So in this diagram here, we have 4 quadrants. So this quadrant down in the bottom left, we might call the happy place, or we might call this safe, the safe place. And what does safe mean? Safe means free from any risk of harm. So in a practical world, in a real world, that almost never exists. The best that we can hope for is to move to a place where the severity of risk is minimized, that's moving to the left, and the likelihood of something bad happening is reduced. So that means moving down on the graph. So that takes us to the bottom left quadrant, the happy place. So the worst place to be is this place where the consequence or severity of the risk is very high. And if those risks are very likely, then the best thing you should do is to get out of the place where you're at, because this is when you are going to be vulnerable to a black swan event, a high consequence event. Now, this area is focusing on just the idea of severity. So we can see that on the left side of the graph, we have the severity is not very severe at all. It might be somebody getting a hangnail, or something, a paper cut where it's easily treated. It might cause you a little discomfort, but it's going to heal and everything's going to be fine. And maybe one person gets a paper cut. And then on the right side of the graph, we have the other end of severity, where what we might have is 1 million people dead, or 100,000 people dead, anything along those lines, or high casualties moving to the right side of the graph. This is the place where you don't want to be. One thing that Nassim Nicholas Taleb does mention in his work is that once one of these high consequence events happens, the likelihood is irrelevant. The likelihood is somebody's prediction of whether there was a high probability that this event would occur. But once the event does occur, the probability becomes 100%. When you are approaching high consequence, the likelihood, or somebody's idea of the likelihood of the thing happening, doesn't really matter so much. And that's where we get into the idea of the precautionary principle. So there was this meeting called the Wingspread Conference on the precautionary principle. And it was a 3-day academic conference where the precautionary principle was defined. And they did that in something that they called the Wingspread Statement. And I'm just going to read this really quick. The release and use of toxic substances, the exploitation of resources, and the physical alterations of the environment have had substantial unintended consequences affecting human health and the environment. Some of these are high rates of learning deficiencies, asthma, cancer, birth defects, and species extinctions, along with global climate change, stratospheric ozone depletion, and worldwide contamination with toxic substances and nuclear materials. We believe existing environmental regulations and other decisions, particularly those based on risk assessment, have failed to protect adequately human health and the environment, the larger system which humans are but a part. We believe there is compelling evidence that damage to humans and to the worldwide environment is of such magnitude and seriousness that new principles for conducting human activities are necessary. While we realize that human activities may involve hazards, people must proceed more carefully than has been the case in recent history. Corporations, government entities, organizations, communities, scientists, and other individuals must adopt a precautionary approach to all human endeavors. Therefore, it is necessary to implement the precautionary principle. When an activity raises threats of harm to human health or the environment, precautionary measures should be taken even if some cause and effect relationship are not fully established scientifically. In this context, the proponent of an activity, rather than the public, should bear the burden of proof. The process of applying the precautionary principle must be open, informed, and democratic, and must include potentially affected parties. It must also involve an examination of the full range of alternatives, including the no action alternative. So government and businesses, in order to support just normal human activity, we encounter risk all the time. What we really, as a society, want to do is try to either minimize risk or, as Nassim Nicholas Taleb says, that we need to make our society more robust to uncertainty and more robust to system failure. But it seems like we must do our due diligence in order to identify risk, which is what the EIS, the Environmental Impact Statement, and the related Quantitative Risk Assessment, a QRA, which we didn't really discuss much, but that's what these tools are supposed to do. And I do believe that these are good tools. This is an activity that we should be undertaking, is that we should be looking at. We should be trying to do our due diligence to identify risk of the activities that we are proposing to do. But as we have heard from the experts, making decisions based on these risk assessments has not been protective of human health or the environment. So we have to be doing more, and that's where the precautionary principle comes into play. Now, I want to present a radical idea, and that is that as environmental activists, like I feel like I feel like it's all of our duty to protect the water supplies that we drink. That's an important civic duty. So I want to suggest the radical idea that we actually apply an EIS, an environmental impact statement, to our own activities. So as an example, we have this group of people that went and shut down 5 different tar sands pipelines by going in and closing block valves. They supposedly studied what they were doing. They took some classes. They dressed up in protective gear, and they took bolt cutters and they cut locks, entered these facilities, these industrial facilities, illegally, and they turned valves to shut the pipeline down. And supposedly they took some actions to minimize the risk, meaning they called the operator 15 minutes beforehand, supposedly, and to inform them that they were going to shut down the pipeline.
Well, 9 climate activists were arrested Tuesday for attempting to shut down all tar sands oil coming into the United States from Canada by manually turning off pipelines in Minnesota, Montana, North Dakota, and Washington state. The group, which calls themselves Climate Direct Action, includes 5 activists and 4 other supporters and videographers. They posted pictures and videos online that show them cutting chains and turning the manual safety valves to stop the flow through the pipelines. This is climate activist Leonard Higgins.
I'm in Coal Banks, Montana, just north of the Missouri River, at a block valve on the Spectra Express pipeline. It carries tar sands oil from Canada down into the U.S. for refining.
That was Leonard Higgins at the site of the Spectra Energy's Express pipeline in Coal Banks Landing, Montana. This is Emily Johnston waiting to turn the valve at one of the Enbridge lines in Minnesota.
When it's done doing that, we'll do this one, which with any luck will mean they can't undo it, and we'll go over there.
So the problem with this is that closing block valves is extremely dangerous activity. You know, these system operators, it requires a massive amount of technical expertise. Starting up these pipelines and shutting them down is not a trivial matter. Sometimes it takes coordinated effort spanning 1,000 miles or more. So this is not something to be undertaken trivially. And operating these pipelines requires a huge amount of specialized knowledge, technical knowledge, and also things like having system maps, diagrams showing where these different pipelines and valves interconnect. So I know this guy called Mike Holmstrom, and he is a pipeline historian. What he has shown is that around a dozen times that he's been able to find, pipelines have actually ruptured because the operators of the pipelines made technical errors. They closed block valves inappropriately, and that caused the pipeline to rupture. I published a theory in 2013 that this is what happened with the Mayflower, Arkansas spill of the ExxonMobil tar sands pipeline there, that it was actually a mistake by an operator of the pipeline who was actually following normal operating procedures, but the underlying fault was a bad sensor. So the operations team saw a faulty sensor indication. It was a low pressure alarm, which they interpreted as that the pipeline had ruptured and was spilling out. They dispatched operators to close block valves, and that is in fact what caused fluid hammer, a shock wave that went backwards and actually caused the pipeline to spill where it did. So this is my theory, but the fact is that we do know around a dozen instances where pipelines were in fact caused to rupture by operators making mistakes and closing block valves inappropriately. So if we look at Mayflower, Arkansas, it's still messed up. The cove, the trees are still dead there. People are still sick in Mayflower, Arkansas, still suffering health impacts. This is years later. This is coming up on 6 years later. The trees are still dead in the cove. So when these pipeline spills happen, they can take decades for the environment to clean itself up. We can never completely clean these spills up. These spills can contaminate an aquifer or an ecosystem potentially for decades. So while I've never heard these valve turners actually express this, what they might be embodying is a certain kind of cost-benefit equation. In other words, they might be saying that for the cost of a 100-year local catastrophe as bad as something like Mayflower, Arkansas, if the benefit is averting climate change, might this be worth it? And there is an argument to be made for that to avert mass extinction of the human race and all life on Earth, that causing a 100-year local catastrophe as bad as something like Mayflower, Arkansas, might be worth it. But for a symbolic action? So my advice to any potential valve turners out there, don't put others in the line of harm without their consent as you try to be a climate hero. That sounds like ego. All of our work should be unambiguously nonviolent. And furthermore, all stakeholders and potentially impacted persons must be involved in the decision making. And the other thing is discussion about ethics. And the ethics of action was studied greatly by this guy called Mohandas K. Gandhi. And he developed a system that he called Satyagraha. Satya means truth, so it means truth force, Satyagraha. What Gandhi's method is, Satyagraha, is the method of putting your own body in the way of some harm. And this is our right to put our own body on the line. However, it is never anyone's right or just power to place other people into the line of harm that did not voluntarily put themselves in that position. But this is exactly what valve turners do. Now let's go back to our little model of risk here, where we look at severity and opportunity or likelihood. So as we said before, we always want to be moving toward the happy place. Wherever we happen to be on this, we always want to be moving toward the happy place of less severity and less likelihood of risk. Now, what do valve turners do? Do they move us closer to the happy place, or do they move us more toward a place where there's a potential for a high consequence event like the Mayflower, Arkansas pipeline spill? And the answer is they're moving us toward the worst place, which is something we should really never be doing as environmental activists. Our goal is to make the earth a safer place, not to increase risk. And the other thing is that while the valve turners were actually putting their own lives at risk, because cutting locks and turning block valves on active high-pressure pipelines and sabotaging industrial facilities in general is a high-risk activity, high risk to your person. But it is also increasing the chances that something really, really bad would happen, a catastrophe, to many, many, many other living beings. It's not just yourself that you have to take into account. So that's why I am very, very much opposed to industrial sabotage in all forms, including valve turners. And here's another thing. Did these valve turners actually think like they were going to shut these pipelines down forever? No. So it was basically a symbolic action. Okay, that's fine. I believe in symbolic actions, but when is a symbolic action indicated? I would say a symbolic action is indicated if it's going to have good public relations value, if it's going to bring people to your side. And that activity should be low risk. Because should there be an actual spill, well, that's going to have very, very, very bad negative public relations value toward your efforts. It's actually going to potentially poison the environmental movement for decades to come, just like it's going to potentially could poison an aquifer. If you poison an aquifer for decades, you're also going to poison your campaign also for decades. These valve turners, I believe, were very, very, very lucky in that they shut down 5 pipelines and there actually was not a spill that happened. But these people are encouraging this valve turning activity. I've listened to a lot of their talks. They have not renounced their activity. They have not said what they did was wrong. They haven't said what they did was dangerous. They've only gone on a lecture circuit all over the United States promoting these activities. And I guess people don't think this through because in my community, the environmental, lefty, liberal, progressive, we care about protecting clean water supplies. I don't know what we want to call that on the political spectrum, but the people like me are largely cheering these people on, which I think is most bizarre. And that's why we're having this conversation right now. Now, the last thing I want to show you in this very basic video on risk, it's a video that shows a decision matrix that helps you decide how to act in the presence of uncertainty when it's clear that one of the outcomes might lead to catastrophe. And it's called the most terrifying video you'll ever see. Now, this video is specifically about climate change, but this decision matrix can be used to help us decide around any high consequence situation.
When faced with uncertainty like we are with climate change, it becomes useful to look at the different possibilities for the future in order to be able to compare them side by side. So one of the first things to look at is whether human-caused global climate change is real or not. There are 2 basic possibilities, one that it turns out to be false and one that it turns out to be true. Now, this is a key point because this is where we get to set aside that whole contentious debate about whether the globe is warming and we're the ones doing it. We do that by acknowledging that no one can know with absolute certainty what the physical world will do. All reasonable people should be able to admit to the possibility that they might have a mistaken understanding about reality. So, at this point, we all agree these are both possibilities. The second thing to look at is what action on climate change do we take. Let's make column A yes for significant action and column B no for little to no significant action. What that gives us is a grid with 4 boxes, each box representing a basic scenario for the future. Let's take a look at what each of those futures might look like. The first is the future where we did take action on climate change, but climate change turned out to not be true, not be real. So what would the consequence of that be? Well, wasted money mostly. This is what the skeptics are warning us about. Increased taxation, burdensome regulation, bloated government. Now, for the purposes of contrast, let's take this to the extreme. Let's say we end up with massive layoffs caused by draconian regulation, which sparks a recession, which spirals into a depression, which cascades worldwide, and we end up with a global economic depression, which makes the 1930s look like a cakewalk. Okay, how about this scenario where we didn't take action and we didn't need to, so we made the right decision. No big economic consequences, continued prosperity. I'm sure we had some problems, but climate change wasn't one of them. How about this scenario where we did take action on climate change, and it's a good thing too because the doomsayers turned out to be right. Well, we still got the cost associated with that, but in this case it was money well spent because the money and the regulation allowed us to counteract climate change. It still happened, but we managed it. It's a different world, but it's livable. Now how about this scenario over here, where the doomsayers turned out to be right and we didn't take action? Now, since we granted the extreme up here, we should grant the extreme down here. And in that case, it gets kind of ugly, because we've got economic, political, social, environmental, and public health catastrophes on a global scale. This is your worst case scenario. This is the sea level rising 10, 20 feet, entire coastal countries disappearing, hundreds of millions of people worldwide displaced, crowding in on their neighbors, causing widespread warfare over scarce resources and long-standing hatreds. We've got entire forests die and burn, massive droughts alternating with catastrophic floods. We've got the breadbaskets of the USA and Russia turned to dust bowls, causing catastrophic famines, terrible disease epidemics spreading like wildfire, hurricanes like Katrina becoming the norm. I mean, this is a world straight out of science fiction. Economic collapse because the global economy has been hit by crisis after crisis. This is a world that makes Al Gore look like a sissy Pollyanna with no guts who sugar-coated the bad news. Okay, so we've simplified things here a little bit. The clue should be the smiley faces. Any diagram of smiley faces certainly has some complexities underneath. So here's the argument. You can think of it in terms of row thinking versus column thinking. Our future will fall roughly in one of these four boxes. Now, because climate change may or may not be real, we cannot know for certain which row the future will lie in. What we can know for certain, because we control it, is which column the future will lie in. So it's a bit like buying a lottery ticket. You buy lottery ticket A or ticket B, and then you sit back and wait to see what the laws of physics deal out as the result on your ticket. So let's say we pick lottery ticket A. At that point, we're determining that our future lies somewhere between a global economic depression and a different but livable world. So here's a scenario where we made a mistake. We acted when we didn't need to. And here's the cost of that mistake: a global economic depression. This is the risk associated with buying lottery ticket A. Well, that sounds like a pretty scary risk, so let's see if we have a better option over here on lottery ticket B. If we pick column B, and it turns out to be the right choice, then hey presto, we're happy. And if it turns out to be a mistake, what would the cost of that mistake be? The end of the world? Well, the end of the world as we know it. The globe will still be here, humans will still be here, the species will survive, but this is a very different, much more hostile place. This is the risk associated with picking column B, whether by deliberate choice or, and here's the scary part, by default of inaction because we were busy debating, trying to guess which row the future would land in. Notice that this cost down here, this consequent, incorporates a threat to the economy that this one up here does, but with some added bonus features as well. Also, it gets worse than that because in the last 5 years, we've learned that it's possible, it's plausible, that this might happen abruptly in a very short time period, perhaps as short as a decade or two. So we're not just talking abstract grandchildren here, we're talking you and me. Now, don't take my word for it on this. Don't take anyone's word for it. Do this to yourself. Listen to information on climate change, and when you hear it, ask yourself, are they talking about guessing at rows, or are they talking about choosing between columns? Because I think you'll see that however you construct this, the argument still leads to the same inescapable conclusion, which is this: when faced with uncertainty about our future, the only responsible choice, the only defensible choice, really the only choice, is column A in order to eliminate this as a possibility. Because the risk of not acting far outweighs the risk of acting.
February 4th at 8:45, Montrose, Pennsylvania, at the courthouse. February 4th at 8:45, Montrose, Pennsylvania, at the courthouse. It's a big thing. It's a hearing. Somehow I got dragged into this thing. It's Ray Kimball's case, Cabot versus Ray Kimball. Remember a year ago, Cabot was suing him for $5 million? It's still going on, and I've been dragged into it. There's going to be a hearing. The hearing is going to be on 3 motions to quash by me, Craig Stevens, and Julianne Skinner. I think Craig Stevens. He's about to file his, and he's hoping to get the same date. So it's going to be 3 motions to quash that are going to be heard on February 4th. That's coming right up. February 4th. 2019 at 8:45 a.m. at the Montrose Courthouse. Susquehanna, that's called the Susquehanna County Court of Common Pleas. So this is a big deal, friends.